So the text this morning is from Matthew 23, beginning in verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. This is God's challenging word. I stepped down and I immediately knew something sharp had gone into the bottom of my foot. I had been surfing at a spot in Pebble Beach. I wasn't wearing anything on my feet, and there's rocks everywhere, and I'm carefully navigating, getting from the water back onto land, and I stepped down, and I knew right away, I'm like, that's not good. And so I get out of the water, I go back, and I look, and I'm like, I can't really see anything, but I feel like there's something there, and I don't know, And then the next couple of days, I could feel like there was something, but I couldn't see anything. And it's this tiny little, And for months, I would just, I'm like, it'll heal. And it never healed. And it just didn't feel right. I mean, I could get away with walking, but if I went a certain, way on my foot, I knew something was there. But the difference was, it wasn't urgent, right? In my perspective, it wasn't urgent. I could avoid it easily enough. And if you're like me, you're good at avoiding things if you're able to, right? Good at avoiding hard things that I don't want to deal with. But the reality is, eventually, with wounding, even if it's like a tiny little thing in the bottom of my foot, wounding is wounding, and there comes a point when the wounding has to be treated. And so finally, months go by, and one day I can't take it anymore. I'm like, okay, it's getting worse. It's more and more painful. So Maddie and the kids, they get we get doctors on duty in our living room going, and so the kids get their toy microscope out, which was surprisingly effective. And they, so they're looking with the toy microscope. Maddie gets a razor blade, and sure enough, they pull out a small, tiny piece of sea urchin that was in my foot for months. And once the source of the wound was identified, it was removed, then and only then healing could begin. And I would argue, and I don't think I'm alone, that the church in the West, not just All Things New Church, but those of us, this broader corporate community of Christ followers, the church in the West appears to be more and more aware of deep wounding in our world today. These are not new issues. These are not new sort of issues manufactured by some leftist agenda. These are issues of injustice and wounding that have been in existence for decades, if not centuries, if not millennia. And our text today records Jesus fighting against very similar issues of injustice. Because as much as we think, and we try to think that we're doing a good job and we're progressing as a society and we're moving forward and we're loving each other well, the reality is we are a broken, sinful people, and we are always falling short of perfect love. Always. So how does this relate, though? How does this relate to a generous life? Because that's what we're talking about. That's the series that we're in right now, considering the ways that God is inviting us toward a greater, more generous life. And how does that connect to sort of being renewed by God for the sake of renewing the world with God? Well, let's talk about financial and economic wounding. Here's a wound that we should name. Did you know that in 2020, the American consumer debt was estimated to be over $14 trillion? That's eerily and frighteningly close to one of those made up numbers that my kids come up with. $14 trillion. And if we don't see this as a wound in our culture, it's like we're walking around with something stuck in our foot that we just kind of want to avoid. We live in a culture that I think encourage us to live in such a way that we should consume more than we're able to responsibly afford, and debt simply continues to rise and rise and rise and rise. And then someone, here's how it kind of connects back. Then as debt rises, then someone comes and asks for help. Or a people group, an entire people group, whether it's the African American community, whether it's the Latino community with immigration, an entire people group demands that systems change and systems of injustice have to change. And we think to ourselves, how can we possibly afford to sacrifice on behalf of anyone else? We all suffer from the effects of a society that fails to bring justice to all. And the reality is we are all suffering from a wounding of lives individually and corporately that refuse to be generous toward the other. And ultimately we suffer from wounded relationships with our God and our neighbor. And Jesus in some ways is trying to tell that, trying to explain that to these Pharisees and the scribes that had drifted off into a place where they were no longer loving God well, and they were definitely not loving their neighbor well. So as we come back to this text and we try to unpack it a bit, it's helpful to stop and pause and ask the question, who is Jesus to you? Who is Jesus? I think the sort of Sunday school answer, which I agree with, by the way, is that Jesus is God in the flesh, God with us, Emmanuel. He's the visible image of the invisible God. That Jesus is also fully and completely human. So he's fully divine, he's fully God, he's fully human. He was born into this world and walked in this world, and he lived and he died, and then he, of course, rose. And yes, I say all that about who I believe Jesus is. And also, it's important to acknowledge and recover the fact that Jesus, in his ministry, in so many ways, was recovering and participating in the broader prophetic tradition of the Jewish people. That Jesus was, in so many ways, also fulfilling the role of a prophet, right? And I'm not saying his identity begins and ends as a prophet. No, I think he is God, and I affirm the divinity of Jesus. But it's helpful for us to acknowledge that Jesus was a prophet, and we shouldn't assume that prophetic words of rebuke are left only for the prophets who came along before Jesus. The ministry of Jesus is one that it fits within this broader prophetic tradition. And what is that tradition, you might ask? Well, there's a lot of aspects to it, but one of the simple ones is the prophets are those presenting the truth of God in a way that's beyond the scope of independent human reason or understanding. Donald Frisk, covenant theologian, he says, Jesus proclaims God's holy will and makes known a transcendent reality which otherwise would not be known to human reason or experience. So in this sense, Jesus is in many ways like a prophet coming in and saying things of God that just the people of the time, the people in the moment, and honestly, the people today have a hard time understanding. In this moment, Jesus is continuing the prophetic tradition of calling God's people back to a way of living that's shaped by their love for God and their love for neighbor. So you think of the prophet Amos, who spoke out against God's people, saying that they were engaged in rampant expressions of injustice toward others, saying, let justice roll like waters. Isaiah calling out people for being unjust again. But then, of course, in that judgment also follows it up with a promise of hope, of restoration and life abundant that we see fulfilled in Jesus. And Micah, the prophet, reminding God's people, well, what does God require of you? He requires to do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. Which, by the way, our denomination, that's why one of the great missional priorities, the kind of mission priorities of us as a denomination is to love, mercy, do justice. That is not antithetical to the gospel. That is central to it, because God says, I want justice to flow like waters. I want you to do justice. I want you to love kindness. Walk humbly with me. So in the tradition of these prophets, Jesus speaks out to the religious leaders, and he says some harsh words. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." And there's a tendency, I have this tendency, we all have this tendency to read Scripture as if we're on the side of Jesus. And I think there is also an invitation, a challenge perhaps, for us to read this and acknowledge the fact that it is possible that we are probably closer aligned to the scribes and Pharisees, the hypocrites, especially those of us in church circles. If you're visiting us and this is the first time you've ever checked out church, hey, that's probably not you. It's those of us who've been around for a while. We're like, oh man, we got it wrong. But really, I think there's an invitation there for us to not read this as if we're the ones who have it right, but to allow Jesus' prophetic words to speak to us here and now today. And Jesus continues, says, "Look, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, these herbs and spices, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law." So what he's talking about is, he said they would take a tithe, which is a tenth of the mint and the dill and the cumin, and they would sort of donate that. They would give that in an act of worship to God. He says, "You've neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others." It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. "You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel." Strong language. Jesus has some harsh words. Anna Case Winters writes about this moment in Matthew's Gospel. The Pharisees are criticized for attending to these trivial things at the cost of weightier matters like justice and mercy and faith. And there's also kind of this play on words where, in order to give a tenth of an herb or a spice, you have to weigh it out. And Jesus says, yeah, you weigh all this, but you're neglecting the weightier matters of justice and mercy and faith. Pharisees also would practice this, would take something they were about to drink, and they would strain liquids to avoid ingesting an insect or a bug that had gotten into because they didn't want to swallow anything that was deemed ritually unclean. And Jesus calls out, he says, yeah, you strain a gnat out, you got like the little bug, that's gone, but you swallow a camel. And he twice quotes from Hosea, and he reminds them that God is a God who desires mercy, not sacrifice. And so Jesus sees God's people forsaking justice and mercy and faith. And let's remind ourselves that justice, of course, is all throughout Scripture. And if we have a challenging sort of disposition toward this word justice, may we be reminded of the brilliant words of Cornel West, where he says, "Justice is what love looks like in public." Right? And so love is this, and Jesus sees them giving up the pursuit of justice for the sake of sort of checking a religious box. And he's giving up fully grown, wide-ranging, all-encompassing love for God and one another. But they wouldn't abandon God altogether, right? They would still obey the commandments just enough, just enough to kind of get by, right? They would do just what they had to in order to kind of like be okay with God, right? It's kind of like, this guy who won the lottery, right? He won the lottery, won $3 million in the lottery. And then immediately he wins the lottery and he publicly declares, he says, "I have decided to donate a quarter of it to charity." And so he does that, and he comes back, and now after donating a quarter of it to charity, he had $2,999,000, $999 and 75 cents, because he gave a quarter of it, right? But like that's absurd, right? But also, that's sort of like what's happening here. It's this like, yeah, I'm gonna give only what I have to. They would still obey his commandments, but in a way that just does just enough to kind of like check the box. And I can relate to this because if you're like me, there's sometimes things that need to get done, and I do them like just enough to technically do what was asked of me, but really I'm not passionate about it. I'm just like, all right, let's get this done. And the problem with this moment of God asking his people to tithe to him, and is that they had reduced an expression of love down to a religious duty. They had substituted robust acts of love toward God and neighbor, and they gave up love for this. This is what they gave up love. They gave up love for religious charity. They gave up love for religious charity. And that is never a good deal. And religious charity, right? It's, if you could define it, maybe it's something like this. It's giving away just enough to make someone feel good about themselves, but never enough to bring broad, restorative change to the broken world of which we are a part. They gave up love for religious charity. It's like flipping a coin to someone in need without caring about their suffering. So what does Jesus say to this? What is, does it stop with the you give up weight of your matters and you strain a gnat out but you swallow a camel? Jesus continues and he says those who give from a place of religious charity, those who sort of enter into these practices with just kind of like forsaking love for religious charity, what does Jesus say to that? He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you clean the outside of the cup and of the plate, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee. First clean the inside of the cup so that the outside also may become clean. And you're like, okay, Jesus, I get it. And he says, no, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead and of all kinds of filth. So you also, on the outside, look righteous to others, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Are we willing to sit with the prophetic words of Jesus? I think this is a moment in Matthew's gospel where we see that Jesus has no interest in religious charity. No interest. Why does he have no interest? Because religious charity, it puts this nice little Band-Aid, right? A nice little Band-Aid over a deep wound that's affecting both those in need and those in comfort. It provides temporary relief, sure, but the wound remains and true healing cannot take place because the cause of the wound is still there. Like having a tiny little piece of sea urchin in a wound. It will never, ever heal if the source of the wound isn't removed. And healing will never come as long as it's left untreated. So then we think, we think of these religious leaders that would sort of do whatever they had to, check the religious box, do the religious charity, they forsake love, and we get excited. He says, yeah, Jesus, man, calling them out and saying, no, it's all about justice and mercy and faith. And so we get excited and we're like, yes, let's fight the systems of injustice. Let's fight oppression. And it's all about bringing justice to the world. And to that I say yes. And to that I think Jesus says, yes, totally. And by the way, it starts with you. Go out and fight the systems, and it starts with you. It starts with you. And I believe it starts even before that with God breaking into our heart, soul, mind, and strength by his grace and bringing about renewal that transforms us and changes us so that yes, we go out and start doing these things, and that leads to broader expressions of wholeness and flourishing. Because remember, what is he says to them, he says, it is these you ought to have practiced, right? The giving of, you should have practiced these things. You ought to have practiced them. You ought to, yes, do that. Tithe your dill and your mint and your cumin. Do that. Without neglecting the others. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And let's be honest, like some of us in the church, right? Some of us throughout the community of Christ followers, some of us were great about tithing. It's a part of our practice, it's part of the spiritual discipline and growing in Jesus. But sometimes those of us who practice this, anytime there's a conversation about justice and mercy, there's pushback, right? Some of us are good at regularly giving. It's part of the monthly budget. There's self-sacrificial giving. There's generosity, but then it's like, yeah, let's talk about justice, and it's like, whoa. What? Right? Because what's happening then? The conversation is continuing and it's shifting from religious charity to something else entirely. And religious charity is comfortable. But then, of course, on the flip side, some of us are great about justice and mercy and faith. We want to fight the system. We want to go out and do all this stuff. But tithing, giving sacrificially, monthly, regularly, that's not as consistently practiced. It's like, no, it's a system issue. What could I possibly do with my own finances? It's all about getting policies in place, and it's not, right? To which I think Jesus is saying, it is both. It's all of it. It's not an either or. It's a both and. And this, again, this is where the relationship between personal renewal is interdependent. It's interdependent upon societal renewal. It's so easy to go out and look at all the other people and places and things that have it wrong and never have any sort of change in our own self. So if we want to fix the world, great, awesome. It starts with Jesus renewing our heart, soul, mind, and strength by His grace, and it continues by us then participating in the outside world. What does Jesus say? He says what? What does He say to the Pharisees? He says, first clean the inside of the cup, so that the outside also may become clean. And self-sacrificial giving it's a grace-filled personal discipline that participates in broader movements of God-ordained justice. I'm going to say that again. Self-sacrificial giving is a grace-filled personal discipline that participates in broader movements of God-ordained justice. It is a both and. This is a vision of a generous life. If you consider the parable of Jesus, where He talks about the Good Samaritan, right? Jesus presents a vision of powerful love toward one's quote-unquote other, right? Someone is beat up, left for dead by the side of the road. A priest walks by, a Levite walks by. They avoid entering into the suffering of the other. And then a despised Samaritan walks by. The sort of typical villain of the story comes, and the Samaritan goes and enters into an act of solidarity and bringing about this sort of movement of charity, of bringing them to the inn and saying, look, I'll set them up. Whatever charges come on them, give it to me. I'll take care of them. And that's a beautiful act. And yet, if all we do, right, is find ourselves flipping coins to a beggar, there's a tendency that we have to slip into religious charity. And I think the way that Jesus presents the Good Samaritan, I think it goes beyond just religious charity, because he walks with this person. But of course, with this parable, our tendency is to think of, oh, well, I gave a couple bucks to the guy and so now I'm good. And this is, of course, where Martin Luther King has one of his most brilliant challenges, I think, that I've ever read. With this parable, he says, on the one hand, we're called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside. He's, of course, affirming the teachings of Jesus. He says, but that will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. In God's kingdom, religious charity has no place, but instead, Jesus desires restorative generosity. Jesus desires restorative generosity. This is generosity that doesn't simply check off a religious box at the expense of another's suffering. It's generosity that embraces personal discipline in collaboration with broader movements of justice. Personal righteousness leading to systemic justice. Personal righteousness leading to systemic justice. If for some reason this is a challenge, if you think I'm sort of drifting off from Scripture, from the biblical mandate for justice, know this. The Greek word that we find in the New Testament that is often translated justice, dikaiosune, right? That word is often translated justice. And often, you know how else it's translated? Righteousness. Righteousness and justice often are translated from the same word. So if you're reading, if you're like, no, it's all about righteousness, it's all about righteousness, you're right. Guess what another word for righteousness is in Scripture? Justice. So how do we do this? What does that look like? In a culture with mounting consumer debt, a growing wound, how do we live into this generous life? How do we shift from religious charity to restorative generosity? Here's the answer. You ready? Lovingly live on less. Lovingly live on less. Lovingly. It has to be lovingly. And this is lovingly. It's giving away resources that in a tangible act of loving God and neighbor, right? Break down the passage. Jesus is like, look, for you tithe, the tenth, a mint, dill, and cumin. This is sacrificial love expressed toward God. He says, but then also there's the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, faith. In other words, sacrificial love for neighbor. And when we lovingly live on less, we experience a freedom that enables us to be generous toward God and our neighbor. Dave Ramsey, who's this sort of like financial leader and mentor in helping people to experience a kind of financial freedom, he says, financial peace isn't the acquisition of stuff. It's learning to live on less than you make. We shift from religious charity toward restorative generosity when we ourselves are willing to lovingly live on less. Cool. How do we do that? What does that mean? What does that look like? It looks like this. Decide how you will spend your money before you even get it. Decide how you will spend money before you even get it. And this is why I love Ramsey's term of financial peace. And peace, again, remember, is not just the absence of conflict. Peace is a sort of holistic, restored sense of life. The peace is this sort of shalom of wholeness. Decide how you'll spend your money before you get it. What does that even look like? Two things. Give to God and others first. Give to God and others first. And the second thing, pick a percentage, not a number. Pick a percentage, not a number. And then, if you're willing, over time, prayerfully consider raising that percentage. Give to God first. Give to God and others first. In the agrarian days of God's people, there was this sort of practice, this giving of the first fruits. Why? Why of giving of the first fruits? Because if we don't give first, there's not going to be any left over. If we don't give first, by the time we're done doing what we want to do, like, it's gone, right? And then second, pick a percentage, not a number. So the reality is, the sort of money that we're entrusted with, that we're called to steward, it's hard to have a good gauge on the exact number all the time, right? Because maybe you work an hourly job and you're not sure how many hours you're going to work this week versus the next week, or maybe it's overtime, or you got really good tips at this, or maybe those who have investments, there's earnings, you don't know what the market's going to do, and so and then there's salary adjustments, you got to raise, you got to cut, whatever it might be. So it's easier to say, like, look, here's the percentage that we want to be at. And look, this is a discipleship issue. There are some people who identify a very high percentage of what they want to give away to someone else. If this is a new practice for you, do not think that you'll just tomorrow, like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to give away 10% of. You may have to start at a fraction of a percentage. Again, this is an invitation for you to live into the fullest expression of your humanity by living a generous life. So start reasonably, and then over time, prayerfully consider how you can raise that percentage and live even more generously. The other thing too is when you pick a percentage, if over time you earn more and more income or money, whatever that looks like, if you've picked a percentage, you know what it does? It helps you resist the temptation to reduce giving as you earn more income, right? Because if you go from making a certain amount and then say you're making like 3 times that, and all of a sudden you realize you're like, man, now what I'm giving away, that's a lot of money, right? If you commit to a dollar amount, it's just, it doesn't necessarily always reflect, right? And perhaps we could find ourselves in this moment where Jesus is calling us out. He says, man, you're checking a religious box. You're not engaging in restorative generosity. I think a generous life is lovingly living on less. And when we do this, we experience a generous life of stewardship toward God, acknowledging God as our ultimate provider. And then, of course, when we do that, we get to be a part of how God is moving in this world to bring wholeness and justice and life for all. So how might God be inviting you to lovingly live on less? And start reasonably. Start where you can. And prayerfully consider where you might go from there. And again, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. If giving to a church, or if giving to this church is out of the question for you, that's okay. Start and give a percentage of your income to someone or something else beyond yourself. Start with that percentage and build on it. I think many of us, we too often trade a holistic approach to generosity for a flippant moment of charity. When we pursue this as an expression of faith, we come dangerously close to religious charity. And Jesus doesn't want religious charity. He desires restorative generosity. For me, I think of one of the pieces of street art that Banksy created many years ago, where he has this picture of someone that you think is sort of begging and asking for change. And of course the sign says, "Keep your coins, I want change." Keep your coins, I want change. Of course, anytime we talk about things like this, there's pushback. There can be pushback against some of these ideas, assumption that that's some kind of like leftist, whatever, or maybe on the left you're like, no, it's, whatever. You can get pushback, and there's debate concerning reparations as an example, right? In this country, we're like, how, in light of chattel slavery in this country, how do we move toward reparations? And one side says we need to tear it all down and take money from the rich and give to the poor. And the other side says, are you kidding? How could we ever do that? And yet, what does restorative generosity look like in this moment? What's a third way of Jesus? And I want to close with a vision that author Sarah Shin describes in a moment of kind of restorative generosity, or restorative justice, as she uses the term. As we consider what it might look like to move toward healing from our nation's horrendous past with slavery. And as I read this from Sarah Shin, this is like a vision that she sort of presents, like a dream, if you will. I want you to pay close attention, because as I sat with this, as I sat with what she wrote here, I was thinking to myself, I'm like, wow, this is like, in some sense, like the most perfect embodiment of our core practices here at All Things New. So listen and consider how this is a vision of hospitality. It's a vision of kinship. It's a vision of justice, of nonconformity. It's a vision of growth toward God and one another. Sarah Shinrise, she says, imagine the great-grandson of a white slave owner. Imagine if you would say to the grandson of a slave, imagine if he said this, would you become my family? Your nephews, nieces, and children will become a part of my life. I will help you make sure that they will be able to graduate school and go to college so that they have access to the opportunities needed to flourish. Come be my family. Come vacation with us, dine with us. Teach me how to love you. Let us be one. May we find ourselves lovingly living on less for the sake of God and neighbor. May it be so, All Things New.